New York State Executive Chamber, Lieutenant Governor Robert Duffy.
Morning, Chairman DeFrancisco, Chairman Farrell, distinguished members of the committees. I'm Lieutenant Governor Bob Duffy. On behalf of Governor Andrew Cuomo, I'd like to thank each of you for the opportunity to come before you today to talk about these very important issues facing our state. The Governor and I have been traveling across the state to speak with citizens about how we are at a crossroads when it comes to our budget. We are facing the same crossroads regarding education funding. Now is the time to put the students first and demand performance. Today, New York spends more per pupil than any other state in the nation. Yet when it comes to performance, we rank 34th. That's right, we are number 1 on student spending and number 34 on student achievement. What exacerbates the situation has been how, over time, and with the influence of those who do not have the best interests of our children in mind, the laws governing the funding to our schools have been written in a way which grants an automatic 13% increase in funding this year and another 13% funding increase next year, regardless of the academic and performance outcomes for our children. Who do you think benefits from a 13% increase? Based on past performance, that money will not necessarily go toward improving education, but it will help feed the bureaucracy. The education system in the state has gotten record increases over the past decade, and we can no longer afford it. This year, our schools are going to have to do what every family and every business in our state has already done. They're going to have to find ways to tighten their belts. Instead of throwing money at a broken system, the governor's budget has a plan to spend less but spend smarter. First, the governor has proposed a $250 million grant program that will create a race to the top all across our state. The school districts that have the greatest improvement in student performance would win funding and bring rewards to the local level. Then we could take their successful models and implement them at a statewide level. Second, the governor would also have a corresponding competitive grant program for school districts that save the most money, find management efficiencies, and develop the most innovative ideas. We should reward those ideas and institute them across our state. The governor's budget also calls for reductions in state spending across the board. For example, the governor has proposed a 10% cut in spending on state government. By contrast, the average reduction the governor's budget has proposed for school spending is 2.9%. A 2.9% reduction can be managed with a combination of good local administration and common sense reforms. And as we've said so many times before, it does not have to mean layoffs. We are saying this to school districts, to local governments, and to our own government agencies. Let's find efficiencies, let's find economies of scale, let's share services, and let's cut the fat. I reject the idea that there is no waste to be found. We all know this is not true because we know government and we know that we can make the system work better. That is why we will offer waste reduction teams to any school district seeking assistance in reducing expenses. Following a review, the team will make non-binding recommendations on actions that can be taken to reduce spending and get rid of waste. What's more, right now, school districts have $1.2 billion in their reserves and $355 million in unspent federal stimulus funds left over from last year. That's over $1.5 billion right there. Our entire 2.9% cut is equivalent to $1.5 billion. So in reserves and unspent funds alone, many school districts could cover the reductions that we need. Another way that school districts can easily deal with the necessary budget reductions is through a wage freeze. If school management and teachers implemented a wage freeze, like the governor calls for state workers, they would save $1.1 billion. This step alone would cover most of the spending reduction. And school districts would save another $600 million if they required the same employee health care contributions as state employees make today. We also urge school districts to look at the current levels of their bureaucratic salaries. The governor, as Attorney General, did in many cases in the area of administrative compensation and salaries. New York's highest paid school superintendent makes $386,000 a year, and over 40% of superintendents receive salaries and benefits totaling $200,000 or higher. Add to that the more than 2,000 school administrators who receive at least $150,000 in salaries and benefits. If it's about the students, now let's find savings within that bureaucracy. The governor's point is this: our school districts can deal with the cuts that we need through a number of methods, whether by finding efficiencies, using their unspent funds, freezing wages, or reducing administrative salaries. The districts have the power to do the right thing and help our state reduce costs without laying off teachers and without negatively affecting our students. It is time for our school districts to face the fiscal reality. We are all in the same economic crisis. The answer cannot be send us more money, because there is simply no more money to send, and we will not raise taxes to do it. Now is the time for all of us to come together, take a new look at school funding, and finally fix the system for the sake of our students, our teachers, and our schools. And just in closing, there are just 3 points I want to reinforce. We have choices and options available to us that do not require layoffs of teachers. It's about wasted inefficiencies. As I mentioned, Governor Cuomo is making available a team from his government to go out to any district who says they cannot find reductions, who cannot find waste in their current budgets. The governor is making available resources to send out to help them find those. And the last thing I want to say is that we are number 1 in spending. We are number 34 in results, and it's not about just throwing more money at the problem. We have to look at the education system. I look forward to working with this body, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to come and testify before you this morning.
Thank you. Questions? Deborah Glick.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for being here. In your testimony, you made reference to waste reduction teams that would be available to school districts. Would those be executive chamber folks, or who would they be?
How the governor envisions this is that for any district across our state that says they cannot find any waste or efficiencies, he would make available resources within the current chamber. I would give examples, people like Paul Francis from SAGE and others that would go out and work with that district to help them find those efficiencies.
Thank you. Senator?
Senator Marcelino.
Morning, Senator. Doing great.
Could we have a more substantive question?
There goes your time. Your microphone is still not on.
You mentioned the fact that we're first in student spending and we're 34th in achievement. What's your scale on the achievement business?
I think the overall achievement would be graduation rates, test scores. I think in terms of assessing that, the ranking, it's taking all the criteria into play.
Competing against other states or other countries?
My sense is it's competing against all states. We're 34 on a national level. We are ranked 34th in education. And I come from a city that, in a recent article in the New York Times, only 5% of those who graduate are considered college ready. The graduation rates are normally under 50%.
The $250 million that you talked about in competitive grants, is there money to back that money up in this year's budget?
The governor's making available 2 pots of money, $250 million in this budget, one for methods that will increase student proficiency, 4th and 8th grade test scores, graduation rates, student achievement, ways that we can close the achievement gap among students. The second pot of money of $250 million is for management efficiencies. It's going into for districts that can find ways to save money, share services, reduce overhead administrative costs without impacting children.
So that money would be impacting this year?
That money would be available in this year's budget.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Further questions? Kathy Nolan, Chairman Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell, and thank you, Lieutenant Governor Duffy, for being here today. It's always good to read the papers here in Albany. So I'm sure you saw in the Daily News today a columnist, Bill Hammond, has a column on today's hearing and on education issues. And in the story, he says, second, the 2007 agreement to gradually increase state education spending by $7 billion, reached in response to the lawsuit by the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, was, in retrospect, an unrealistic promise based on an inflated interpretation of a misguided court ruling. Could I have your thoughts on that?
Well, Assemblywoman, what I could, first of all, reinforce is the state and the governor is still committed to the CFE funding. I don't think that has changed. But I read the column just before I came here this morning, and I think I have experience as a mayor of Rochester for many years looking at the amount of spending that went in. We were over $20,000 per student. We were the city that, back in the 1980s, had a landmark labor contract that associated higher pay increases and cost with achievement, which did not come to fruition. And it's living proof that just putting more money into the system does not work. I would equate it to turning on the heat in the house in the middle of winter and opening doors and windows. We have to look at the system. And we have to look at the system in a way that benefits children. So even with the CFE funding, which I said the governor is committed to, I think this is about, the governor is all about performance. It's about looking at ways that we are spending the money and making sure that the ways we do spend it do impact children. If I could say from personal experience, I've argued this for years. If some of that education money could be somehow assigned to children in higher needs districts for employment after school and on weekends, these kids are in just incredible poverty, which I think does impact learning. So any way that the funding that is available can be directed more toward children and student achievement. And with the CFE funding, the governor's not backed off the state's pledge. He just wants to make sure any money that is invested is spent smarter and is based on performance.
Could you elaborate a little bit on how you see that fulfilling that pledge?
Well, I think the most important thing is to look at what he's doing right here with this budget. He is asking school districts across the state to join every family in meeting the financial challenges that we face across the state and trying to do a better job with the same or less resources as best we can. And I think we have to look at what we have spent money on and why are we still 34th in the nation. And if we were number one in spending and we were number one in results, we probably would not be having the conversation across our state, but we're not. And so what the governor wants is challenging ways, and this is a very tough sell because in many cases people do not want to change and look deep within themselves, but it's looking and make sure the money we do invest does end up having an impact on children. And I think so much of the money that we have it gets invested in bureaucracy. It gets invested in areas that do not touch the lives of children. And this is an opportunity, this budget, to make sure that we can get our fiscal house in order, but not impact kids. And there's not an easy answer, Assemblywoman, for that. I think it takes every district across this state looking at introspectively at themselves and see how we can better manage our funds and impact those kids.
Mr. Farrell, I just would respond this way. I appreciate the Lieutenant Governor's remarks and certainly share his concerns that we spend our money wisely and well. I am a little concerned that children are impacted by what we do here every day. And I think that it is a very serious cut in education funding in this budget. I think, having been here a long time myself and shared that frustration at times about New York's numbers and statistics, we have to be mindful of the fact that we have aging school buildings. When you were talking about opening the windows and letting the heat out, I thought you were talking about a school in the New York City district, because so many of them are so old that that's what they look like. I think that we have to really take a look at how seriously this cut impacts children, and I think that I appreciate hearing that you continue to support elements of the CFE decision. I look forward to an additional conversation to see how that support actually translates into focusing on kids, and I appreciate your comments today.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblyman Bob Riley and Assemblyman Engelbright. Senator?
We've been joined by Senators Little and Liz Kruger, and the next questioner is Senator Oppenheimer.
Being here, Governor. Are we on? Are we off? Are we on? Okay. One of the, at least from what I hear, one of the conditions that you say exist in the various Senate districts, assembly districts around the state, is that our school districts can survive in good shape because we all have fund balances, reserve funds, and we can make do with that. However, I believe you know, that there's at least a quarter of our school districts that do not have fund balances. And what are they going to be doing if they have no place to put these losses in revenue?
Senator, what the governor outlined, where those schools that do have fund balances and unspent federal funds, this will be a time to utilize those funds as best they could, and certainly understanding that in some cases reserve funds are helpful in case there are unintended issues that occur. I've gone through that with past budgets in my last job, so I understand that. I think for those that do not have reserve funds, it's again looking at administrative costs, looking at overhead, looking at ways to share services, looking at a menu of options available that would not necessarily impact children. And I think the governor's position is often the first reaction is we have to lay off teachers, and that should not be the case. I think we do not want to see children impacted. We don't want to see teachers laid off. What we want to see is just a look at each organization and looking at ways that high needs districts can share services. And there are, I won't bring up to the body, I mean, my experiences in the past, I've had a number of those, and the frustrations that I've had, I won't air today, but there are so many ways that money could be saved, and government could share money and services in ways that do not impact kids. And I think, going back to Assemblywoman Nolan's question, I think we have to look at the current system. Some districts are very high performing. Other districts are not, and I come from a city where people make decisions to move out. It further impacts the tax base. Where people move, they move away from school districts, and schools can be a magnet for so much. And it really is taking a look at the systems, and I do think with the built-in accelerators, with the system we currently have, I don't think the districts have been challenged enough to look at themselves at ways they could save money that would not impact the lives of children. And this could be an opportunity with this budget, as the governor sees it, to focus on performance. We should be number one in spending and number one in results across this country, and we're not. And I think we are capable of doing that if we really have the courage to take a hard look inside at how we do business. And I think kids, especially poor kids, need more. They need more support in many different areas that they're not getting right now.
But you would agree with me that most of the districts that do not have fund balances are some of our very poorest districts. Many of them are from around your area. And certainly looking at creative thinking, virtual learning, things like that, there are opportunities. But I am very concerned about the very low wealth districts in the northern and western part of our state. But let me turn for a moment to the high wealth districts, since that's what I represent. And you said that the cuts, I think, in our state were 2% or 3% to education. I can only say that all of my districts are over 10%, and that's something like 15 or 16 districts. So some districts are getting hit a whole lot harder. But to continue with this, in the $250 million that you set aside for best practices, for improved, achievement of students, I have been questioned by several of these districts. You've probably heard the names: Scarsdale, Chappaqua, Briarcliff, Rye. They have been saying, what are we to do? We are now at 98% graduation rate. College-directed kids. Should we not even think of applying? What can we possibly do? Send one more kid to college? And I don't have an answer for them. What should I be telling them?
Senator, I know I was at a recent meeting. We discussed some of the districts, or some of the schools in your district, and you have a problem that a lot of areas wish they had with 98% graduation rates. And so, it is maybe the gap in terms of achievement and finding those efficiencies might be a little harder in some districts. I still would offer, the governor's offer, about having a team come down, if that were the case, and help look for that. But I applaud you, and I applaud those schools for the success rates they've had. In the city of Rochester, I think the per capita spending is one of the highest in the state. The student-teacher ratio is one of the lowest in the state. Graduation rates fluctuate between 39% and 50%. And as I mentioned earlier, the New York Times article, only 5% of those who graduate are college-ready. And our district did not have reserves, but there are numerous opportunities to save money there as well. So I think it's a very high-needs district. But sometimes those decisions, they don't want to make those decisions, because I think part of it may be when there are built-in increases every year, when there are maintenance of effort legislations that are put in place, that sometimes it takes that requirement out of some districts where they don't have to make some of those tough decisions. And the governor said families across our state are making those decisions every day if a mom or dad loses a job. And that's what the governor is asking, to look hard inside and not affect kids. I think we can get better and stronger and hopefully improve our ranking nationally. We should be in the top 10 for results across this country.
Okay, well, I thank you for answering the questions, but I don't think you answered that one, so I think those districts should not even bother to put in their efforts to try and go with some of these grants.
But I still think they should, and we would also be offering the assistance to come in and look at ways to save as well. But again, I applaud you for 98% graduation rate would be a rate that many school districts would really be very proud to have.
I'm aware. I agree. Thank you.
Assemblyman Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask questions, I want to note that we've been joined on the panel by Assemblywoman Teresa Sayward, and in the audience we've been joined by Assemblywoman Annie Rabbit, Assemblyman Bob Castelli, and Assemblyman Chris Friend. Good morning, Governor. Thanks for being here this morning.
Seeing we're doing that. We've been joined by Assemblyman Sam Roberts, Assemblywoman Gibson, and Assemblywoman Robinson. Thank you. Oh, no, back to you.
And we've been joined by Senator Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Governor, good morning. Thanks for being here this morning. I'm supportive of what you and Governor Cuomo are trying to do in terms of right-sizing the state budget to what taxpayers can afford. And I think it's important. I want to ask you two questions involving sequence, operationally, how school districts can absorb this cut. I think, first of all, we have to remember that the governor's cut of $2.8 billion, 1.3 of that really is the disappearance of the federal stimulus money that came as a bridge last year when school districts were facing very devastating cuts because of the economic circumstance and because of the very difficult pressures on the state budget last year. So they were given $1.3 billion in federal stimulus, sort of told that that was a bridge to help them get to the next step. Now that's disappearing this year. But in addition to that, the governor is cutting $1.5 billion below what was appropriated last year in his proposal. My question is, how do you, beside the surpluses that some of these districts may have built up, how do you see the governor and his staff and the people from the education department being helpful to districts in terms of mandate relief? The real core issues of the costs that are being mandated by the state government, by the state legislature, by the education department, that our school districts tell us in many respects cost them a lot of money, hold them back from finding ways to save money in their annual budgets. Are you focused on mandate relief, and will you provide the same kind of assistance to local districts in promoting mandate relief at SED and in the legislature as you are asking to help them with surplus funds?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes. In terms of sequencing, I think that would not be as short-term as this budget, because some of the mandate issues may be much more long-term to resolve. But people like Larry Schwartz from the chamber, people like Paul Francis will be leading efforts to identify ways that mandates can be identified and eliminated or reduced. There are a multitude of mandates that impact school districts, that impact cities and counties, that really they have to be examined, and each one of those mandates has a constituency attached to it. So sometimes reducing those is not as easy. In the city of Rochester, we had a mandate for education, maintenance of effort, that required 73% of every property tax dollar be assigned to our schools. And the city had really no say how that money was spent. And I think there are districts that see a myriad of those. I think if we all work together, we can identify those mandates that will ease the tax burden and ease some of the pressures on school districts. It'll be as difficult as a budget process to accomplish, but I think if we work hard, it can be done. And the resources will be available to help. And I mentioned two resources in Larry Schwartz and Paul Francis that will be instrumental in that process.
Of course, another sequencing question, looming large in the discussion, not only for the cuts to education and school districts this year and using surplus funds and saving money this year, is really a one-year effort. I sort of look at, the surplus funds that were available as a one-year effort or a two-year effort to bridge over the gap. Now we're talking, listening to the governor say many of these districts have money in reserve that could be used to help cushion the blow for this year. The question always is begged, well, what about next year and the year after? What will school districts be able to look forward to down the road? I know our budgeting process is a one-year snapshot, But, the criticism of the formulas, I think, were more in line with not necessarily recognizing that the legislature has to put together a budget every year and make some assumptions about aid to education. Looming large in the background, of course, is the conversation about a property tax cap. And again, how that relates to mandate relief and the sequence of it. Could you tell us which comes first in your mind, the chicken or the egg? Is it the tax cap that comes first that will bring us the needed mandate relief reforms, or is it the mandate relief reforms that have to come first, or is there a way for them both to arrive together?
Well, I think that it's a great question. The tax cap is probably the one area that will help push the mandate relief, because I agree, and the governor agrees with the comments that have been made that a tax cap on its own without mandate relief is very difficult. So I think having that at the forefront, it's a provision that people across the state are longing for, but it also is a great vehicle to push mandate relief. And mandate relief, again, is not easy. It's going to take a lot of hard work and have a lot of pushback in different areas. But I think both can come together, whether tax cap perhaps at the forefront with mandate relief as a vehicle to help drive that. But the governor's committed to working through both. He's committed to the tax cap. He's also committed to, again, he's put some of his key staff attached to working on mandate reliefs across the entire state. And to go back to your point about the budget, I do think that if we can bridge this $10 billion gap this year, if we're able to get through a very difficult year, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because the gap is less than $3 billion next year as projected. So there's a huge cut in terms of that gap. It becomes much more manageable after this year. And some of the efficiencies, some of the menus that the governor's put forth, even an issue of a wage freeze. What are you saying? A wage freeze with districts, administration, and teachers, not taking a dollar away, just staying where you are right now for 1 year. That, and even the health care contributions, mirroring our state employees, that bridges that gap in itself. There is a menu there, and not requiring one layoff of one teacher. But I do think if we make the decisions to get through this budget year, it's going to make next year and the year after and the future, I think, a lot better. I think the decisions that we make now during these very tough times could benefit every one of these districts and organizations for years to come.
Thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblywoman Millman, Assemblyman Fred Thiel, and Assemblyman Danny O'Donnell. Senator?
Ranking minority member of the committee, Carl Kruger.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Governor, and thank you for being with us tonight. Albany has a tendency to sort of fight over the pots and pans while the Picassos are walking out the door. And we find ourselves in a similar situation when we're talking today about the budget and about education, about relief teams that are going to come into a district to promote ideas on efficiency. Well, these school districts have to vote on their budgets come May of this year. Those teams are going to accomplish absolutely zero in terms of delivering instant relief. The school districts themselves, we want to talk about a bureaucracy, where there are approximately 700 or 600 odd school districts in this state, some of them in the farthest reaches of the Adirondacks to the end tip of the eastern Long Island, that have a couple of hundred students, and they form a school district. So while we're talking about trying to level the playing field, I know the governor speaks about consolidation, but if we would just look at the consolidation and the movement of those districts, then we would be accomplishing a lot more than worrying about a relief team. If we would talk about school bus contracts, 3 separate contracts, contracts for parochial schools, contracts for lay schools, and contracts for special ed. If we staggered the hours that those buses picked up the kids, we would be able to have one set of buses accomplishing the task that perhaps 3 are doing right now. All of those are instant money saving, not long-term money saving. Rather, what we have to do is, if the governor is have the prescription to start doing the right things that we could accomplish in the short order to sort of lasso in the issue of education We're talking about education, and we're trying to be oblivious to the disproportionate formulas that are the history of this legislature and this capital for time immemorial, and the disproportionate levels of funding between New York City and the Long Island region, and between Long Island region and upstate New York. And when we start bringing those things into balance, kids are kids, and kids have needs. New York City schools produce some of the finest minds in the country and in the world. And if it wasn't for a city university system, most of us would have never seen the inside of a college campus. But today we're at a true crossroads, as the governor has said, a crossroads that has to take us in a direction that perhaps we don't want to go in. We have to perhaps sacrifice 700 superintendents. Maybe we don't need 700 purchasing departments. Maybe we don't need 700 of everything. That's where the real savings comes from. I guess my question to you after I made my speech is, what is going to be, besides the cut, the instantaneous, quick ability for the districts and the education world to say, hey, you know what, we're going to save this big pot of money, not by using our surplus this year, because surpluses of this year means an empty pot for next year. Not by talking about what the future holds, but what the present presents. With the implementation of this budget on April 1st, God willing, on April 1st, what is going to be the instant success story to get us under control?
Senator, you outlined a number of options that I agree with and the governor would agree with. You've outlined ways that there can be some immense cost savings in districts, transportation, and other ways. I think that's the governor's point, is that looking at those areas you can save money. Consolidation, I think there have been 4 consolidations in the last 10 years of all our districts. Everybody wants consolidation, but not in their district, their town, their village, their city. It usually works best someplace else. But now is the time that we have to look at that in our own home turf and look at our own districts, our own cities, our own counties. There's nothing you said that I disagree with. There are ways that those savings can be accomplished. That's exactly the governor's point. The first inclination is to say we have to lay off teachers or take away music and art from kids. That is so far from the truth. It is about looking inside at this immense bureaucracy, whether it's a large district or small, and finding ways to save money that is away from the classroom. And you've outlined some in your comments that I would agree with. And I think that's going to be the focus for these districts. These are things they can do now. These are things they have the ability right now to step in that might not require them to use their reserves, but they could make those savings and bridge these budget gaps. Because I think it was mentioned by Senator Oppenheimer, there are districts that are impacted more than 3%. I think about half, a little bit more than half the districts are about 2.9, 3%. But there are districts that have a larger gap. And that formula is based on trying to do as equitably as it could based on high needs versus districts that weren't listed as high needs. But these are areas this year that can be done, and we can save. But there's been, let's close on this, what I've seen in my experience as mayor, there's been an inability when there's a crisis, and you can't waste this crisis. But in the past, far too often, when there have been opportunities to save money, but there's not been a desire to do that. If there's going to be funding coming in no matter what, sometimes these maintenance of effort or funding increases, it takes away the need and motivation to make some tough decisions like businesses and families have to make around this state every day. So this budget process, as painful as it could be a great opportunity for us to get on a track that would make us much stronger next year, the year after, and the year after that. So that I think you outlined some areas right there that I think should be utilized, and there's many others to follow.
And a suggestion perhaps to the governor and to the executive chamber, we should not focus on the hysteria. It's easy to say we're going to lay off teachers, lay off policemen, lay off firemen, close firehouses. Everybody screams, oh, we can't do that. But the message is clear. In the alternative of laying off teachers, the money is there. The governor has to use his office and his influence to see that these cost savings measures, these consolidations, these review of the way, and I point to the school, but the school bus school pupil transportation is a fiasco. It's a fiasco, and when you start looking at those and he uses his influence to accomplish it, then we will, and New York City as well, even though we look at that as one school district. My part of town in South Brooklyn, you go through yards and acres of school buses, and you see that they're sitting there, oh, we're between runs. Well, you know what? Between runs meant 15-minute flex time between buses. It's unconscionable, and something should be done about it, and I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblyman Jeff Aubrey.
Also, Mr. Chairman, we've been joined on our side by Assemblyman Steve McLaughlin and Assemblyman Kevin Smarts.
as well as Senator Diaz.
No, we don't have any. Do we have anybody else? No.
Liz Kruger.
Good morning. Morning, Lieutenant Governor.
Morning, Senator.
You know, it's interesting that I think my question really falls right after Assemblymember Hayes' issue and Senator Carl Kruger's issue. Since I would say I'm looking at this whole room of people, nobody really believes that there's extra money floating around in too many school budgets for the actual education of children, and yet we know we are faced with the challenge of having to do more with less. I hear a cry for technical assistance from the governor's office and from his agencies to direct school districts how they should make the changes that we need, because I don't think you and I disagree, or anyone here on the panel or behind us, that this state has to continue to make quality education really one of the top priorities forever. Is there a way to actually structure the budget and even though mandate is a dirty word, so I have to come up with a different one, while working to deal with unfunded mandates, to structure the education cuts being proposed as not allowing to decrease investment in the classroom by requiring that the cuts not be made in teaching staff in the classroom. And I guess I would throw the importance of principals in with that, because a good school has a good principal, and if a school doesn't have a good principal, it's a bit more of a hit or miss reality. Some kind of formula where we have structures in place that class size is not supposed to be above X, Y, or Z for different ages. Can we not think about how we help the school districts at this time to prioritize actual classroom teaching with the money that they have? And is there not some way that the governor's office can lay out a formula for this?
Senator, it's a great point. I would defer to this body as you go through the deliberations of the budget as you negotiate and talk about how the budget will be finalized. I would defer to that point. I do think every district can be given, one mandate. That would be look for ways to identify those efficiencies, cost savings, without impacting children. And right off the bat, to hear people come out and say we have to lay off teachers, we have to cut programs that are vital to kids, especially kids in high needs districts. I disagree with that. The governor disagrees. It's looking at other areas. And I think Senator Kruger, the other Senator Kruger, just mentioned a couple of areas of transportation. There are so many ways that if we look at our systems, how we could change, and that's what Governor Cuomo is offering, is that those districts that say we just are at the point we can't identify one more area of savings, and the governor said he will send in a team to help. But in terms of how the budget is structured and written, in terms of where, I think these are decisions that could be probably best implemented at the school level and district level as opposed by us in Albany. But that should be the requirement for every principal, every superintendent, to look first at every way to save money away from impacting children.
Thank you.
Senator Flanagan is the last questioner. Oh, I'm sorry. And he's not. Okay, Senator O'Mara.
I think that's on. Yeah, that's working now. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Duffy, for being here this morning. I represent the large district in the Southern Tier, Finger Lakes region, with a lot of low-wealth districts, which seem to be heavily hit with these cuts that have been made so far, in particular upstate. The numbers that I have, and correct me if they're wrong, but upstate New York has 45% of the students in the state's population, and they're getting 53% of the state aid cuts to their districts. New York City has 38% of the students in the state and receiving a 32% cut in their aid. Can you explain to me why the differential in these cuts and the higher impact to upstate, particularly low-wealth districts, has?
Senator, I don't have the list right in front of me, but when the cuts were made, the average is just under 3%. But the formula used by the Division of Budget was trying to take or not have the cuts impact the high needs districts. So some other areas were hit a little harder. I think Senator Oppenheimer mentioned her district. There were some disproportionately high cuts. The formula was just that, trying to spare the high needs districts. So while more than half, just a little over 50%, were at 2.9 to 3%, some were higher. And I certainly could get a list of those districts that you are concerned with and get an answer back to you by the end of the day today.
The other area of concern I have, we talk a lot about shared services and the need to find efficiencies there. And many of the districts in my region have utilized shared BOCES services, yet in the governor's budget proposals, you're taking away state aid for those shared services that have resulted in efficiencies and cost savings for these districts. What's the rationale behind that cut to that aid?
I think that, again, the cuts were trying to be made as equitably across the board as they could. I was approached by one of the superintendents of BOCES last week who talked about some of the impacts that he was facing. But I think he had recognized the needs. He made his argument, but he also was going to go back and look for ways that they could absorb that cut. So I don't disagree with the fact that in some cases there have been consolidations, there have been shared services, and those districts, some of those districts may be impacted by this. But the Division of Budget, the governor tried very hard to equalize those cuts as best they could. It's not a perfect world. There's some areas that, and I think through this process, I think those areas could be identified and perhaps rectified. But the superintendent of BOCES, and I'm a big supporter of BOCES and how they prepare, especially young people, for employment. There are ways that even he said they can find to absorb those cuts. They have to go back and work a little harder at that. So I don't think I have a clear answer. I don't think there's anybody who is going to say that they're not impacted. I think the entire state's impacted. Everyone is losing something. I think we have to take a look at those systems, and I do think there are ways with BOCES, with the school districts, that we can find even greater efficiencies and shared services that would save money but not directly impact children in the classroom.
Well, there's not one district that I represent, superintendents, school boards, the teachers there, that understand the cuts are going to be significant and they're going to have impacts on the entire system, and everybody's ready and willing to do what they can with that. The concern is that there's disparate treatment among districts, and it's hard to balance everything out. I understand that, but with the numbers I pointed out between upstate and downstate, I think it's not a fair share, and it appears to me that with the low-wealth rural districts and the impacts that they're having, particularly if the property tax cap goes through, when they have such a small portion of their budgets that are real property tax levy based, it's mostly state aid, that 2% increase to these districts is not going to let them make ends meet without significant drastic cuts in the services they provide. And it appears that there's an effort to force consolidations of these rural low-wealth districts without coming right out and saying it in these budget proposals. But I also, at the same time, don't see what consolidation incentives are there in this budget. What incentives are there for schools to consolidate at this point?
Well, the one area of incentives in terms of management changes, which could include a consolidation, is the $250 million pot for efficiencies. There's two different pots, one for student achievement, test score increases, shortening the gap. The second one is for management efficiencies in districts, for practices and changes that would save money. So there is money available in this budget. But, Senator, I'll go back to, I think, the governor's position with this budget is that education has received record increases over the last decade. So there's been a steady increase. And we've got to a point where the state can no longer sustain this. And in this budget, while it's painful, I think we're at a point where we have this budget is going to surely cause pain, but it also will cause us to make decisions that maybe will make the district stronger in the future. If there are increases year after year after year, and now we're faced with a year where there's actually a cut to the base, where in the past there's been the 13% plus accelerators every year, this does pose a challenge. But Senator, I'll go back to my experience with stimulus money. I think too much of the stimulus money was used to supplant budgets last year, as opposed to really making decisions that would make districts stronger. And I think in many ways, the pots of money like that, while helpful, becomes almost, it creates a sense of avoidance from the tough decisions. And we're at a point, I think the governor has put a stake in the ground with this budget that there's nowhere else we can go. We are taxed to death. We have people leaving our state. And this is a challenge, there's no doubt, but I think education is one area that has received record increases over the last decade, and it's going to require some changes. But I do think we have the ability to do that without directly impacting children. And I'll go back to the consolidation issue. There's only four districts that have consolidated since 2000, 2001. I think that is one area that really bears much more work. And again, nobody like that in my hometown, in my area, same thing. Nobody wants consolidation where they are. They want it elsewhere. And I think we're at a point where I don't believe the state can sustain the levels of government, the wide numbers that we currently have. So this could be a great impetus to really go back and look at that. The $250 million will help, and I believe if there is a true consolidation, there may be other ways in the budget to help support that if they can show cost savings.
But again, that $250 million is not in this year's budget, correct?
It's $250 million is going to, I think it's part of this year's budget with the governor's putting in.
I thought there was no funding behind it.
For the two areas, it's $500 million, one for management, one for student achievement. But that's the governor's point, is to put two competitive grants for education, one for management, one for achievement with this budget this year.
But I've been told that is not funded, that those programs are in there, but there's no funding mechanism to have the dollars there for those programs.
It is a hope that the budget is passed, there will be funding for that. That's a part of these cuts, is to put this Race to the Top initiative in place for New York State.
Thank you, Governor.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblyman Levine, Assemblyman Bill Colton, Assemblywoman Barbara Clark.
Senator Flanagan.
Governor, thank you. I'll try and be as succinct as possible. I understand that we're going to have to make cuts, but a couple of questions along with that. Sort of dovetailing on Senator Marcino and Senator O'Mara. Our review, in conjunction with the DOB, on those two pots of $250 million, that's prospective. There's no cash in this year's budget for either one of those programs. So are you representing to us that money is your contention and the governor's contention is that there is funding available in this year's fiscal plan or not?
Well, the intention, based on discussions that I've had, that if this budget is passed with these cuts, that there would be funding available in these two areas. That's what the governor's proposing. I can't state that cash is in hand right now, but that is a proposal. That the intention is to fund both those pots of money, the competitive pots, to help offset and help incentivize some of the changes that would lessen the pain with these cuts.
In light of that, where is the expectation that $500 million will come from?
I would defer to the Division of Budget, but that's the discussion that I've had. That's the expectation that in every discussion I've had is that this proposal with this budget, that if passed, there would be funding for these two different pots of money.
I would appreciate, frankly, for everyone, if the DOB could provide the language that would show exactly what you're talking about. But two other specific questions. Relative to BOCES aid, and I was listening. I'm assuming you can hear me anyway. I apologize. Use the phrase, let's share services. And on the BOCES question, the concept of what's being advanced is changing the reimbursement and switching it to a formula foundation aid base reimbursement. So we're looking into next year. We're certainly not adversely affecting those expenses that districts are entitled to this year. I'm confused on how we can be talking about consolidation, shared services, working together, and then the governor's proposal basically eliminates roughly 25 categories of aidable services that are right at the heart of what you're speaking about. So they're contradicting. I don't know how I can go back, or any one of us can go back and say, this is going to work, because it flies in the face of what we're supposed to be advancing. So I'm not sure what the rationale is.
Senator, the best way I could explain it is that sometimes in a budget, division of budget, there are cuts and lines that are reduced. But the issue of BOCES, which I think was mentioned before by the other senator, I would agree. The budget process is a great opportunity to go back and look at perhaps some of those cuts that are proposed, would impact areas that could save money. So I think that I would just defer to this body and this budget process to identify if there is a cut or a proposal that flies in the face of really what the intent is. I think those are the areas that should be part of this process and examined.
Okay.
I mentioned it before about BOCES. The BOCES superintendent, I was approached just recently, last week in Albany, and he made the exact same argument with me about what they are trying to do. That they have to absorb a cut, but that they also offer a number of services to other districts that are very helpful financially.
It seems to me that what we should be doing is looking at to enhance the BOCES, not eliminate parts of it. And if we follow the governor's proposal, I think there's a real risk that you will create a strong disincentive for districts to participate in BOCES, and that's going to put a much greater burden on the lower and wealth districts to continue to be involved in that program. My last question quickly is 4201 schools. They have traditionally been funded by the state of New York almost in their entirety for well over 100 years, and now we have the creation of what is, I think, fairly described as a new $98 million mandate that will go back to schools and to local property taxpayers, which has heretofore been paid by the state of New York. Can you explain why we would be doing that?
Specifically, I couldn't explain in terms of, I would just defer back to the process. I've not been involved in a discussion with that specifically, so I would best not answer that question today, but I can seek an answer through the DOB and get the rationale sent to this body, hopefully by the end of today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. First of all, I think this is unprecedented where a member of the executive branch, who's actually the Lieutenant Governor of the state, has come before this body to testify before the Joint Legislative Finance Committee's Ways and Means Committee to testify. And you don't know of any other time this has happened where a Lieutenant Governor, a member of the executive branch, has done so, do you?
Senator, I have probably less history than anybody in this room
in
Albany, so you'd be the best one to answer that.
The person who has most history, Denny Farrell, confirmed that, so I know it's true. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of issues here that I'm sure that budget can answer, but I just want to thank you. You didn't have to be here. You didn't have to face the heat. You got all the education advocates behind you. And it's important, in my mind, to advocate for a position that you believe in and the governor believes in. And it's refreshing to see that you're doing this. As far as some of the specifics, I guess Senator Carl Kruger mentioned it's time for backbone rather than wishbone. I think we've shown some backbone here, or the administration has shown some backbone in facing the music. But we just want to debate this thing in a very constructive way. What Senator Flanagan said is accurate. If we're going to consolidate, what sense does it make to cut BOCES? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. As far as Senator Oppenheimer mentioned about her district that has a 90-some-odd% graduation rate, well, maybe it's time to maybe change the formula a little bit so some of the low-wealth districts, or maybe a lot, are able to take less of the cut. My districts are low-wealth districts. The average was about 16%, 16%. Now, that somehow doesn't compute, but it's because of the formula. I'm sure that affects a lot of other people as well. So we appreciate it, you coming here. Secondly, we want to talk constructively with the administration to get this job done. It has to be done. Thank you.
Senator, thank you. And I just, to your comments and also Senator Flanagan's, there are a couple of questions I don't have the answers to, but I think they were great questions, and I think that's part of this process. And I think the governor's position is we have a terrible financial situation, but I think there are ways to work together and find ways that perhaps if there is a decision in this budget that flies in the face of what we're trying to accomplish, I think this process will flesh that out and hopefully address it. But I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the chance to come before this body.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.